Good day, everybody out there in internet land. This is the Two Guys, One Car webcast, podcast, showcast, something or other cast,
And
where two random dudes talk about car stuff. I'm Dave Zip, otherwise known as Curly.
I'm Tom, known as Tom. And we're not two random dudes, Curly. What are we exactly?
We're two wannabe experts that are trying to be actual experts.
So everybody else on the internet, yes.
Pretty much. So in today's topics, we're going to revisit the topic that we discussed in our first episode, which is the FCA-Renault merger, because there's been some pretty major updates there. Then we're going to discuss some of the new performance cars that have been announced or updated this week. Then we're going to talk about, we got two of those. That's two different topics, actually. Then we're going to talk about Toyota. They've got a new push for hydrogen vehicles, as well as a new car partnership with Subaru. And then we've got, how could I forget this one? IndyCar on ovals. This would be a major topic because there was a bit of news there. And then finally, Ford versus Ferrari, new movie coming out. They just released the first trailer. Matt Damon and Christian Bale were at the Indy 500, so we're going to talk about that movie and I guess what we thought of the trailer and what we're expecting out of the film. So, with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. Again, that first topic was the FCA-Renault merger. And Tom, what happened in that merger this week?
Well, Curly, some things have happened since we talked about that just last week. We talked about this merger, all the cool things that could come of it, how beneficial it would be to both partnerships, and FCA pulled out this week. So there's a lot of hearsay going on right now. There's a lot of fingers being pointed at Nissan, a lot of fingers being pointed at the French government. The basic story is that the French government wanted to take a few more days before finalizing this deal because they were planning a trip over to Japan to talk to Nissan anyway. So they asked for a little bit more time, and FCA just said, "All right, we're done here." So we gotta dip into this a little bit here. Because that seems like a simple question to me with such a big deal, asking for a few more days to try and get Nissan a little more involved. That doesn't seem unreasonable to me. What do you think?
I completely agree with that. It seems to me like, it sounds like it seems to be more the FCA side that were kind of the issue here, since as you said, the French government wanted a little more time. Nissan definitely needed to have a better understanding of what this partnership or this merger was going to entail, and how it would affect them. And then here's Fiat Chrysler seeming to assume that they were going to walk into a boardroom and then, a couple hours later, have at least a handshake deal. That seems kind of, to be honest, it seems kind of ludicrous. I mean, we know that any kind of a business deal, especially one that's going to be this big, it takes a long time to negotiate all that. So to go into one official meeting, one publicly official meeting, I mean, we don't know what kind of. Surely there was discussions about this that were not made public before the public meeting this week, but to go into a single public meeting and then immediately say the deal is off, it just seems like either FCA had no idea what they were getting into, or maybe Renault didn't really know what they were getting into, and there's definite miscommunication on how far along these talks were if after a single meeting one of the parties is saying we're done.
So this is
and,
pure.
and especially when that's the party that has been saying for years they want to merge with another car company.
Yeah, and I think this is pure speculation here, but with
But Renault
FCA,
didn't bring out the best wine, did they? They only brought out the cheap wine for Fiat. The Italians know better. You do not
yes,
bring us your best wine and cheese. We
no,
we no merge anymore.
no, they didn't bring the authentic champagne, and that pissed everyone off.
Yeah. Gotta make sure. I mean, the only real champagne comes out of France. So.
And no good French cigarettes. That was another
Mm-hmm.
big thing. Sergio would have turned over in his grave. But anyway, I think a big issue here is I feel like there was definitely a miscommunication between Renault and FCA, and I think Renault might have exaggerated how much Nissan was into this and how much they knew about this beforehand, because the talks were just between Renault and FCA. So the French government, I don't think was involved. I don't think Nissan was involved because they came out like the next day and said, "Wait a minute, no one talked to us about this. What's going on?" So FCA sits there like, "Wait a minute, you guys didn't talk to your biggest business partner about this before you agreed to this deal? You didn't talk to the government that owns 15% of your company before going into this deal?" And so maybe they figure that Renault doesn't have their shit together and pull out. I don't know.
Yeah, and on the other side of that, Fiat's maybe Fiat underestimated, or maybe I don't want to say they weren't aware, but they may not have really understood the depth of how those three Renault parties are entangled. As you mentioned, there's Renault, there's the French government, and there's Nissan. Obviously, the French government has a major say in this because they are a significant shareholder in Renault, as is Nissan, by the way. And you know, even though Renault and Nissan could shell each other's shares and divest themselves, on a business side, on a shareholding side, very easily. Um, we know that that partnership dives a lot deeper, especially on the actual automotive side. There's a lot of intellectual property owned by Renault that Nissan has access to, that Nissan needs, and I'm sure there's a good amount of it on the other side of that as well. There's a lot that Nissan has that Renault is using, so it's not like it's not like Nissan can just pull away from Renault. And as we said last week, probably be financial suicide. Now, the other thing that kind of struck me about this is I wonder if Renault was really being all that serious to begin with. And I'll say it because we know that part of the ousting of Carlos Ghosn was that Renault wanted to actually merge with Nissan and create a single car company. I have to wonder if Renault didn't enter these partnership talks not because they were serious about merging with Fiat, but they were trying to put more leverage on Nissan. Especially along the lines of, if this merger was working out and was continuing to move forward, it would basically force Nissan's hand. Like we said last week, Nissan really can't afford to pull out of the Renault deal. They're just not business wise. They're not strong enough to stand on their own in today's global car market. So, if Renault is merging with Fiat, then it's basically all right, you can either ride or die. So I wonder how much this was just to force some leverage on Nissan to either try to merge completely or, maybe just improve that deal on the Renault side and continue to take over, or even just revenge for having their CEO ousted. I mean,
Yeah.
that Nissan stabbed Renault in the back over that, and this might be Renault sort of returning the favor a bit. It's going to be very curious how this plays out and what information leaks. Who was the party that really made the deal end, and what was the true motivation for putting this together and having it all fall apart.
Yeah. Yeah, and on the flip side of the Nissan Renault thing, Nissan does need Renault a lot, but I think on the flip side, Renault needs Nissan a lot because Renault's main foothold is in the European car market, which quite frankly is crumbling. So they need Nissan just as much as Nissan needs them. And if they had Fiat in there, that would be a powerhouse. But just Nissan and Renault alone is already a powerhouse.
And I wouldn't necessarily say the European market is crumbling, but it's certainly not growing. And if your only major market is Europe, that's a problem. Because you're right, Renault is kind of locked out of the Asian markets, which are expanding in leaps and bounds, and they're definitely locked out of the U.S. market, and I think even a lot of the North American market. I don't know how many Renaults are actually shipped to the North American continent to begin with.
There might be
I don't
some
know
in
if they go
Canada.
to, yeah, yeah. I be honest, I don't know. I don't know if they ship, if they sell in Canada or Mexico or anywhere else like that. But yeah, if their major market is Europe, that's a market that's not growing. Whereas in Asia, you've got China, you've got India, you've got all the various Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam is a growing country, growing market. Malaysia. These are all markets that their economies are growing. Tourism is huge in those areas. this. And so you've got a lot of people who are starting to make money and they want to buy cars, and they'll buy whatever's available, whether it's a Chinese car or a Nissan or a Daewoo or a Daihatsu or whatever it is. They want to buy it. And if you're not selling there, you're not going to get your car sold. So you're right. Nissan does need, or I'm sorry, Renault does need Nissan in many ways, just the same way Nissan needs Renault. So, like I said, this is going to get interesting because there's been some backstabbing from the Nissan side. I kind of wonder if this is some backstabbing on the Renault side, and really, how far is this going to continue? I mean, are they going to continue to attack each other? And if they do, what's going to happen to this partnership that seems to be, I mean, this partnership has worked for both companies. If it falls apart, what's going to happen to them?
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see if FCA continues to be a player in this situation or if they feel completely burned and pull out completely. I I don't know. We all know they wanted to merge under Sergio. Mike Manley has said he wants consolidation, but he's not as strongly in favor as Sergio was. So it's going to be interesting to see if Fiat still continues to pursue this or if they even start to try and find others.
Yeah. And again, I think it's really going to depend on what happens with Nissan Renault. I would suspect that if, I would say there's two things that are going to hinge on making this deal happen. The first is going to be how serious was Renault to begin with? Were they only using this as a leverage tactic or revenge tactic on Nissan, or are they actually serious about merging with Fiat? And then the other part of that is going to be how does this very public sniping between Renault and Nissan? I think those two have to be on the same page before Fiat would be interested in opening talks, and either they're on the same page as one company or two companies. So, and to be honest, I don't think FCA would be opposed to merging with both of them if they're open to it, even as separate entities. I mean, I think it would be remote since Nissan's not seemingly willing to merge with anybody really. But I could very much see a Fiat, Chrysler, Renault, Nissan, which is going to be an ugly acronym. FCLNAMAOFUCK.
They're gonna need an overarching group name there, because that doesn't exactly roll off the tongue.
But to be honest, Worldwide Auto. I mean, that would make the most sense. You've got Japan, you've got Italy, you've got France, and you got the United States all under one umbrella. That is Worldwide Auto right there.
Yeah, and you don't really need. You can keep the brands separate. That's what Fiat has done with kind of keeping Chrysler its own thing over on one side. So they could just have one main company name and then all the subsidiary brands. But I don't think Nissan is unopposed to merging. I think they were just taken aback by the whole merger situation because, according to them, they were left in the dark. So maybe now that Nissan is brought to the table, they're obviously going to be a little hurt that Renault tried to do this, but I don't think they're diametrically opposed, especially after all the turmoil that is post-Gozen.
Yeah, I think again. Well, I mean, part of the reason that Nissan tried to, or well, didn't try, they successfully ousted Ghosn, was that Renault wanted to merge with Nissan, and Nissan didn't want that. They want to be an independent car company. They don't want to be, or I should say, they don't want to. I mean, they want to be a Japanese car company. They don't necessarily want to be this giant global group. I can understand the pride in that, but I think the reality is different these days. You can't just be a Japanese car company. You have to be really a worldwide company. And you can sit there and be proud, but pride doesn't make profits. And at the end of the day, if Nissan can't make the money on their own, then they're going to have to work with somebody. And right now, the only people who are willing to work with them are Renault and maybe Fiat Chrysler. I will say if they are willing to merge, they're going to want to be, part of a co-equal branch. What they don't want is they don't want this to be like the Daimler Chrysler merger, where it's supposed to be a merger of equals that wonderful phrase. But then it basically turned into Daimler just sucking the life out of Chrysler, and that's a real worry. I mean, if I'm at Nissan, I would be worried about that. Okay, we've got these two car companies on their own that want to work together that are huge compared to us. I could very much see a scenario where it's Nissan is they're just sort of dragged along for the ride and they don't get the same kind of say that Renault and FCA do. And I think that's a legitimate concern too.
We're also kind of forgetting the wild card sitting there hanging out with Nissan, and that's Mitsubishi.
Mitsubishi is the bitch in all this.
I mean, they're nothing in the States, but they are a big deal in Japan. They're a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, you can be a big fish in a small pond, but
sure,
that's really not saying a lot.
Sure, but I think Mitsubishi's just along for whatever the hell Nissan wants to do at this point.
Yeah, I mean Mitsubishi, like we said about Nissan, if they want to be a big global car company, then they need to be working with larger companies that have the stock, the financials, or the financial security, and the networks that Fiat and Renault have. But it's even more so for Mitsubishi. They have, well, I mean, they have never really had that. Their best years were actually under. That would actually be ironic because remember, for a long time, Mitsubishi was owned by Chrysler. They were part of the DSM group.
I remember.
Yeah, and I mean that was probably one of Mitsubishi's best periods. So, and actually that's a really good example of a mutually beneficial merger because the small cars and trucks of Mitsubishi allowed Chrysler to grow in areas that they previously didn't have any kind of a foothold in. And it gave Mitsubishi the kind of dealer networks and supplier networks that it needed to grow and thrive. So, that was a truly beneficial merger for both sides. Some of the great small Chryslers of the 80s and 90s were actually Mitsubishis.
Yeah, and
it's a shame that the Mitsubishis weren't better known because they had some pretty cool stuff. Like just in naming alone, like one of my favorite trucks of the 80s is the Mitsubishi Mighty Max, which was their tiny little, it was their compact truck, and it actually went racing because the SCCA had a road racing series for compact pickup trucks, which, by the way, the Jeep Comanche just dominated that series. But Mitsubishi was there with the Mighty Max. But yeah,
that was a good time for Chrysler engines too. That was probably some of their most reliable engines at that time.
Yeah, depending on the engine. I mean, some of their engines were definitely good. Some of them had water pump issues and they leaked coolant into the oil, which is a very, very bad thing. Actually, if anything, that's where, to be honest, I would say that Chrysler's small engines right now are probably way better than they were in the 90s. They're certainly more efficient and they're a whole lot more reliable. I mean, there are a lot of horror stories about some of the old the 5.9 V8 or the 3-liter, whatever it was, 3.1 or something liter V6. The oil sludging issues. I mean, to be honest, a lot of Chrysler's best motors were Mitsubishi motors.
Let's be realistic though. The best engine, the 90s better than, or now better than the 90s engines, that's a pretty blanket statement. We're kind of in the peak of the horsepower versus reliability segment. There are some exceptions, obviously, but for the most part,
V18C5, which for all you non-Honda nerds out there is the Integra Type R engine.
Nerd.
Yes, I'm a nerd and I love it, but you see, again, that's sort of if you're talking about American engines, yes, the engines that they're putting out now are leaps and bounds ahead of what they were creating in the 90s. But, I think some of the best Japanese engines came out in the 90s, and some of their engines now are incredible. But, no, yeah, there's no doubt about it. I'm not going to lie. I am biased for 90s Japanese cars. But, generally, I mean, again, so I mentioned the Integra Type R. That is still one of the highest output per displacement engines ever made. and it's naturally aspirated. I should say it's one of the highest outputting naturally aspirated engines for its displacement. I mean, at the time, I think the only engines that beat it were one or two Ferrari engines. So here you have an engine in a tiny little Honda, an economy car, and the only engine that makes more power per liter than it wasn't even the Ferrari F50. It was one of their V8s. Like the list of engines that were more powerful per displacement was very small, and that list has gotten only slightly longer in the last 20 years. So yeah, that's sort of where I stand on that particular area.
All
On the
right.
other hand, the 90s did not have the S2000 engine, which is one of the few engines that is more efficient than Integra Type R engine.
All right, now that Curly got to indulge himself with 90s engines, we're gonna finish this topic here with the singular question: what now? What do you think is gonna happen now that FCA has pulled their offer, at least for now? Do you think they're gonna come back to the table, or do you think they're gonna just let Nissan and Renault have a family feud?
I think the latter. I don't, Fiat knows what it wants. It wants a merger with somebody for very understandable reasons. But merging with a pair of car companies that are openly feuding is just a bad idea. So the key in all of this is going to be Renault and Nissan and mending that relationship. Until that happens, they're not going to merge with anybody. And if they wait too long, Fiat may find somebody else. If you're looking at car companies that could benefit from a merger, Tata, because they own the Jaguar Land Rover group. Yeah, I mean, I can see you laughing there, and you're right. That's an odd one, but that's another car company that's trying to grow outside of its bounds. And if you're looking at, okay, Tata has a great foothold, a huge, they dominate the Indian market. That's another area that's growing in leaps and bounds. So that gives FCA an opening into India, and it gives Tata an opening into the rest of the world. So yeah, if I was Renault and Nissan, those heads, I'd be working this out pretty quick because I would not be surprised if FCA and someone like Tata Motors or some other smaller company start working together. We could even go crazy and say maybe FCA and BMW.
Yeah, I don't think that's ever going to happen. BMW is just off in a corner. But I think you're right. The FCA, I think one of the biggest reasons they pulled out is because they did not expect all this drama. I think, like I said, I think they thought Nissan and Renault and the French government had already talked about this, and I'm not sure that the gains that they would get from becoming a company with Renault and Nissan are worth all this right now. So I feel like they're just going to let Nissan and Renault do their thing. Because let's not forget, FCA is doing very, very well right now. And I think you got hit the nail on the head that finding a small car company to merge with is the optimal situation. Because the biggest thing they need that they don't have is battery tech and EV tech, which brings me to my thought and my perfect partner. Now that the stock price has dropped a little bit, he's hinted at merging a little bit. Tesla.
Hmm.
FCA is a lot bigger than Tesla right now, despite that all powerful stock price. So maybe Musk says some stupid things, drops the stock price a little bit, then they start coming to the table. But Tesla has exactly what FCA needs. They have the massive battery factories that they're building and that they already have. They need more factories. You know who has more factories or the money to buy more factories? FCA. So I feel like those two.
That's an interesting theory, but number one is you already sort of hinted at. You're talking about wanting to merge with a company without a lot of drama. Tesla isn't exactly it. Part of it is Elon. There's no doubt that he very often sticks his foot directly into his mouth. Sometimes both feet at the same time. But outside of Elon Musk, there's some pretty major questions about Tesla and their viability as a company. I mean, we've heard the stories about trying to get the Model 3 production up to speed, and they literally built a factory or an assembly line outdoors. It was like a tent factory. So,
And you know who has the factory support and the manufacturing engineers to support them?
Tata.
That's still a funny name.
It is. It is. But I mean, they're actually doing pretty good. I mean, the fact that they were able to buy JLR. Well, I mean, buying JLR from Ford in 2007, like I'm sure you and I could have pulled enough money to do that. And we were both. Well, no, you were in college at that point, like, or no, sorry, high school. You were still in high school when they got sold. I think maybe
I
a
could
freshman.
I
Yeah,
could pull
either
some
way.
I could pull some string and quarters out of my pocket. We could have made it happen.
Exactly. Well, I will actually come to Tesla's defense for a second, kind of weirdly. I really hope they don't merge with anybody, especially a big established car company, because the one thing I do genuinely like about Tesla is that they are a force for change. You know, they are forcing established car makers. First of all, they forced them to actually get serious about electric cars because they showed there is a market for this type of car, and we're going to dominate it until you guys get up to speed, which Tesla's doing. And I think the other thing is they're also forcing car companies to rethink how they develop cars and how they sell them. I am a huge fan of direct buy car buying. I hate the dealer network. I hate that you're forced to go through someone who's going to bump your vehicle price by 10% or more if it's a really rare one. So, yeah, business wise, it would be great it would be smart actually for Tesla and FCA to merge. But in terms of how that's going to affect the car market, I would not be a fan. So yeah, Tesla's got a lot of problems, but they can be a force for good. I would say they're kind of a chaotic good in the car world.
They
Emphasis
are
on the chaotic.
they are a force for change, but they are also struggling to try and figure out what they're going to be, and they're eventually they're going to run out of cash, and eventually they're going to need to sell that tech. And I think that's the reality of the situation. They're going to need some help at some point. At some
Hmm.
point, VCs are going to stop dumping money into them. That's right now. That's all they're surviving on. So we'll see.
Yeah, I do think Elon's biggest problem is he kind of got too big for his britches. When Tesla was first starting out, they were very smart about how they were going to get their foothold and grow. And I feel like Elon has kind of drank too much of his own Kool-Aid. So yeah, um, maybe if Elon gets kicked out of the board, there might be some hope after all. But yeah, Tesla's a very weird car company, and in many ways, I think they need Elon Musk in order to survive. Like, yeah, he's definitely a lightning rod, but he's also, lightning can start fires, but it also gives us electricity. So
And he's also the only reason their stock price is so high.
exactly, and that's exactly my point. Is yeah, he says and tweets a lot of stupid stuff sometimes, but he's also the reason they're doing as well as they are. So yeah, that I mean that would be an interesting merger. We'll sort of see how that one works out. So
Manly.
yeah. So we spent a lot of time on that. Let's talk about something cooler, like for example, a new fancy BMW.
Yes, the BMW has announced the new M8, which is not really the new M8. It's the only M8,
Mm-hmm.
since the last one was only an 850 something something, either an I or a
Eight
CI, depending on who you
is the
ask.
850 Ci, and it's one of my few BMW loves because it's a funky looking car with pop up headlights, and it's got a V12,
Well, this car has none of those things. It, I
which is
mean,
why you're going to be talking about all of this because I have no interest.
I mean, it's the 8 series, so it's a really beautiful car already. It's a really nice looking Grand Touring coupe. It is a bit massive. It's got a similar engine to the old M6, which mysteriously disappeared. I really don't know why they stopped that one. That was an extremely cool car.
So I need to catch up quickly live on air. Was the last M6 a V8 or a V10?
V8.
Okay,
They have not
turbo
made a
V8,
V10
right?
in a they have not made a V10 since I think that infamous V10 and the M5.
Yeah, but it also went in the M6 too, which is why I asked. The first gen
Yeah, no.
M6 had that same V10.
Yeah, no, it was a 550 horsepower twin turbo V8. This
By the
one,
way, one of my other BMW loves would be the M6 with that V10.
and then you'd go bankrupt.
Don't
but
care. I'm gonna go bank. This coming from the guy who really, really, really wants to own an M3.
that is not
Anyway,
as that's not as unreliable as a V10. Anyway, they
don't
bumped
care.
up the they bumped up the power from 550 in that car to all the way up to 625 if you get the competition package. You get a lot of carbon bits, but unfortunately, unlike the M6, there is no manual. So while I talked about this awesome new BMW that is not made out of duct tape and fairy dust, I'm going to let Curly indulge himself in his car while I do literally anything else.
Yeah, so if you listen to Tom's spiel on the M8 and you went, "Wow, none of that sounds really appealing. There's no manual, there's no V12, there's no active aero, there's no awesome car designer behind it." Boy, do I have the car for you. The Murray Automotive T50.
Great
Now,
name, really rings off the tongue, you know.
just like M8, well, I mean, like 850 CIX1234-1. Anywho, the Murray T50. Murray is Gordon Murray, and if that name sounds familiar, first of all, he is the man who designed the McLaren F1. He also designed at least three of the great Formula One cars. Actually, he designed multiple incredible Formula One cars. He started out at Brabham Formula One. One of his well-known cars there is the BT48. I'm sorry, BT42B, which is the infamous fan car. Really, Gordon Murray shaped modern Formula One with how the aero works and how the cars are styled and how center of gravity is everything and small engines, small gearboxes. But for what most people know him for is the McLaren F1. He designed that car because he worked at McLaren. He also designed McLaren's MP44, one of the most successful Formula One cars of all time. Well, he's coming out with a new supercar. It's basically the McLaren F1 2.0. It's got a V12 designed and built by Cosworth. It's got a 6-speed manual gearbox designed and built by X-Track. Both of these are very famous racing names. It's got 3 seats like a McLaren F1. It is all carbon fiber. It's under 1 ton in weight. It's going to have very few electronic gizmos on it. And the neatest thing that I've never seen in a road car is it's going to have a giant fan in the back to help the ground effects. It's really exciting. It's going to be a proper driver's supercar. You can buy a $2 million supercar from one of the established brands, and this is going to be a tour. This is going to be a proper, it's McLaren F1 2.0. And I know Tom does not believe this car is ever going to come to fruition, but I'm super excited about it. I mean, we talked about the Ferrari last week, and neither of us could bring up anything really cool about it, but this has got everything that we want. It's got all the excitement. It's got a manual. It's got a naturally aspirated V12 built by Cosworth. It's the first hypercar in years that I've truly gotten excited about. And I know it's going to take forever to come out because this is a, brand new company, but it's also Gordon Murray, who is, I think, probably the best Formula One designer of all time. And that includes Adrian Newey. And of course, one of the things that makes me most excited about this is that with the Aston Martin Valkyrie coming out, we're going to see a proper Adrian Newey versus Gordon Murray shootout, which that excites the hell out of me because unfortunately those two they crossed paths in F1, but it was not at a point where either of them were at really their peak. I think Murray was retiring and Newey was just coming up into Williams, so there was never that direct on track battle between those two cars. So I'm really excited to see that happen in road cars since we never got it in Formula One. So that's my spiel, and let's talk about.
Wait, I can't wait for the one car they hacked together with the duct tape to be bought by a Saudi prince and then mothballed for 20 years.
Yeah, at least it would have happened.
Anyway, so transitioning to a topic that I know Curly is really anticipating talking about. So this week, Max Chilton has announced that he is going to be stepping out of his Indycar for the oval track races the rest of the season. Now, one of the reasons he gave was basically that these tracks are too dangerous. Now, one could certainly argue some performance metrics that might be the reasoning behind this, but it brings up the greater question on whether IndyCar at ovals are too dangerous. We have seen some pretty massive accidents recently. Robert Wickens being the most recent last year, having that serious back injury. There have been many deaths in IndyCar recently. There, of all the major series, they have how many deaths so far in the 2000s? Since 2000, Curly?
I think in the combined series, it's 5 or 6. I know off the top of my head, sort of going backwards, there's Justin Wilson and Dan Weldon, Paul Dana, Tony Renna. Those are the ones that I immediately remember. I can't think of any others in the 2000s. I think their last big spat were in the 90s, so there were a few in the 90s. But those are the 4 that I immediately remember. Now I do also want to add there have been a number of, to be honest, very crippling injuries. Dario Franchitti comes to mind. He ended his career almost going through the fence in Houston. Kenny Breck's another. Same thing. He went up into the fence and in an accident that was probably nastier looking than Robert Wickens. It was actually at Texas, which is the race they were just at, and where they announced that Max Chilton was not going to be racing. He went up into the fence at Texas and just, they talk about the safety cell of the car. That was literally the only thing left. And, Kenny survived, but ended his racing career. So, yeah, there are definitely safety concerns in IndyCar. I don't think you can deny that. When you compare them to NASCAR and Formula One and WEC or just sort of sports car racing in general, IndyCar's track record really doesn't look great. NASCAR has not had a death since Dale Earnhardt, thank God. Formula One, they've had a couple of driver deaths, but none in a race. And
Bianchi.
Well,
that was during the race.
He survived another 6 months. If
you
want to call living in a vegetative state surviving. And to be fair, this is a topic that I could go off on for a long time. I'm actually very keenly interested in motorsport safety in general. And I truly, truly despise it when a series says everything worked as designed. And the biggest issue I had with IndyCar and Pocono last year was they said, oh, the fence worked exactly as designed. And no, if there's a giant hole in the fence, it's not how it's supposed to work. You got lucky. You got lucky the car did not go through the fence. You got lucky that the car somehow bounced its way back into the track. You got lucky that the car hit in a way where it tore the support pole of that fence in half and didn't kill the driver in the process. So, no, everything did not work the way it was supposed to. You got lucky.
So have they made any improvements on that fence since that Pocono wreck?
They have not. Now, I think one of the key things to point out in that particular accident was I know that at Indianapolis in 2016 they replaced every bit of fencing and fence posting. Now, some of that was aesthetics because that was the 100th race, but they did replace all the fencing, which was kind of ironic that the next year they had a car go, rip up some of that fancy new fence. But anyway, so that happened at Indianapolis, but I don't think it had happened at Pocono. And when you saw the pictures of that fence on TV, it was pretty beat up and battered and old and used. So, one thing I would hope that they start to push is accelerated replacement of fencing. Fencing is just steel cable, and that steel does rust. It does age just sitting out there. It needs to be replaced over time. Same with, by the way, the foam and the safer barriers. There's some safer barriers on some tracks that I've seen that are, you look at them and go, man, how is that? How are they still racing against that? Again, that foam degrades over time. It degrades in ultraviolet light, which is our sun. So I think one of the things that IndyCar should push is accelerated replacement of those safety materials, that fencing, that safer barrier foam. I don't know what their schedule is. I don't think that's publicly known. It is expensive though, and that's I know the biggest deterrent for doing that kind of accelerated replacement is that that's a few $1 million to replace all the fencing, to replace all the safer barrier foam, to replace those steel sections when they get damaged. None of that is cheap, and unfortunately, the economics of racing don't really push tracks to do that more often. And tracks are always the last sort of the last takers of safety enhancements. As much as they don't want to see people get hurt or killed, it's their money that goes into implementing those advances. I mean, if you look in the '80s and before, a lot of oval tracks, they didn't even have a concrete wall; they would have guardrail, and that maimed quite a few drivers. And tracks refused to change that because it was really expensive to tear down that Armco and replace it with concrete. And eventually, Indycar said, "Okay, we're just not going to come to your track anymore." And sure enough, concrete. Um, so yeah, it's a lot of back and forth. IndyCar is inherently going to be dangerous, mostly because of their choice of tracks, and everyone's focusing on the ovals right now because they do high speed ovals. I mean, Texas last night was, I think the average speed there is, they were saying it was around 220 miles an hour. Um, you might know better than me. I mean, what's the average in NASCAR
I
at Texas?
At Texas, they're
Yeah,
only averaging about 190 or so.
yeah, and that's a pretty significant difference in speed.
But
Um,
the other big difference with NASCAR versus IndyCar is they're driving big metal cocoons that are around them, and IndyCar
mhm.
are basically 2 inches from whatever they hit.
Yeah, exactly. They're in little carbon fiber darts versus a giant steel, safety cage. Um, Yeah, plus the other big thing is an IndyCar. I mean, they're running flat out at Texas, whereas at I think NASCAR there's a lot of lifting, so the cornering speeds are a lot lower. And really, IndyCar's biggest problem is they've got really high cornering speeds. If you lose it on a straight, you can sometimes save it, or if you do, you can scrub off a ton of speed. If you lose it, um, but at the speeds they're at right now, I mean, they're doing probably, I mean, they're doing about 220 in the corners alone.
And
And when you lose it at a lot of times, you saw this at Indy especially, they were always losing it right at apex, which is going to be it's going to be the point where you cannot recover that spin, and that's where you saw cars go straight into the fence and pancake themselves. And of course, the flip side of that was they would pancake themselves against the wall and they would partially flip over because these cars are very their downforce is heavily dependent on the floor, which I think is good, but they've also got a giant floor section which catches a lot of air when it spins. So um, I think cars going up into the fence is a relatively new phenomenon. It's not something we used to see when the underbody of the car was a lot smaller. So I think the current Indy car, that design is going away in a couple of years. I think it's 2021 or two. They're going to replace it with a new chassis, and I hope when they do, they really look at shrinking the floor area in total. So I want them to keep the amount of downforce they get from the bottom of the car because that has improved the passing and the battling we see on track. But they need to make that surface area of the floor smaller so the cars are less likely to want to flip over when they hit.
yeah,
And I think that's the biggest thing they can do because if you can keep the car out of the fence, then the issues of the cars tearing themselves apart in the fence become much less of a problem. I would like to see some kind of work on the fences too, but um, it's it's going to be a big discussion about cost versus actual benefit because most of the stuff you're going to put in there means you can't have grandstands out there anymore.
yeah, and we saw this. We saw the cornering instability last night. You saw several times when cars were on the outside, they could barely keep control. I Who was it trying to pass for the lead last night? He was going for the outside, and
Rossi.
yeah, and every corner he had to lift because the car was about to twitch. So
Mm-hmm.
it was that instability, and they knew, like you said, a lot of cars when they spin on those high speed corners, they may start flipping. And the fence repair thing, that one, I think you really need to have sort of a heavy hand to go after those tracks in order to do those changes. Because we saw several years ago now, Austin Dillon at Daytona when or was it Austin? No, it was Kyle Larson when I think it was
Dylan
a
also had a
nationwide.
crash like that.
He did,
Both of them have.
but Larson's
Larson's was a lot worse.
yeah, after that, and I think it was like a nationwide race where where he flipped, hit the fence, and his engine came out and went through the fence into the stands. And after
And
that,
that was, I mean, fans got injured in that accident, and
they did.
that was very much an accident where NASCAR was incredibly lucky that more of the car did not go through. In 1998, there were two very high profile incidents in IndyCar, well, IRL and kart, one in each. This was before they had wheel tethers, and they both had an accident at an oval track where a wheel went into the fence and killed 3 spectators in both of those races. Injured many more because that's a high speed, very heavy piece of equipment. And for years that had been luck that okay, wheels haven't gone into the fence, wheels haven't gone over the fence, wheels haven't gone over the fence, but then the circumstances arose and they did. And immediately there was, calls to action, calls to change. There's actually a great story that in sport, they published a story about that in Sports Illustrated. And Indianapolis refused to give their motorsports writer a press credential and publicly announced it. And then a whole bunch of other publications said, "Fine, we're not going to go to Indy either," and they had to reinstate him. I mean, it was very, again, it was tragic. It did force change, but I sometimes feel like the racing series, they're not always as proactive as they should be, and especially when it comes to track safety. And I do understand that there is a major economic factor in all that. Again, the tracks, they don't make a ton of money these days because we're just not all going to races like we used to, and forcing them to make millions and millions of dollars in changes is difficult, because at some point a track may just say, no, we can't do that. I mean, that's one of the reasons that a lot of the great Formula One tracks, they don't race on anymore because they're either unable to or can't afford to make the changes needed to host Formula One. So it's just part of the nature of the game. I hate seeing drivers get killed. It's gut wrenching. I mean, I still get very choked up when I think about what happened to Dan Welch. But danger is also part of racing. It's part of the reason that people like you and I love it so much. I mean, we may not want to always openly admit it, but the fact that these guys are in 200-mile-an-hour rockets and are able to do 500 miles at that speed, it's truly incredible because that there's true stakes behind that. If you try to throw a touchdown and you miss, okay, the ball bounces off. You can get tackled, but it's very different to the constant danger of a wall, less than a dozen feet from your right, 30 cars behind you and a few in front of you. It's a completely different experience. And that is what makes racing so amazing. That's why Ernest Hemingway said there's only 3 real sports in the world. There's mountain climbing, bullfighting, and motorsport. All the rest are just games. So it's a fine balance. You want it to be a bit dangerous, but you also don't want to announce constantly drivers passing away.
Yeah, and without opening the Pandora's box that is football safety, I'm just going to gloss over that one. Back to Max Chilton, though. So we mentioned the performance aspect. He has not taken to ovals very well this year, and
or in general,
and frankly, with that in mind, and with the danger that is very obvious, we all know it's there. I don't blame him for not wanting to run in like the late teens, early 20s and risk serious injury or death just to run 20th. I don't blame him for not wanting to do that.
I completely agree. And I to be honest, I think those two things kind of go hand in hand. People sort of have a misconception because they say, oh, Max Chilton's great on ovals. Well, if you actually look at his stats, he's really not. He had a win in Indy Lights at Iowa, which it's a very short oval. So in many ways, it's like a road course with just a constant wall and you're always turning left. The speeds there aren't very high. And he finished 4th at the Indy 500 2 years ago. But to be honest, he only got there, he had a good car, but he only really got up to fourth because of pit strategy. He got really lucky with how the yellows fell. And, he was never really in contention to win that race. So you have those two aberrations, and then everything else, all of his other results are, as you said, in the low teens or the 20s. He's basically at the back of the field, a lap down. And I think, well, I mean, you probably know this probably more than I do because I know you've done a lot more oval racing than I have, but how comfortable you are on a track is going to really determine the speed you go. If you know, you need to be comfortable in the car to get the most out of it, but on ovals especially, you tend to push that right to the edge of discomfort because a loose car is a fast car. If it's too planted, you're going to be slow, right? Is that? I mean,
Well,
that's true on big ovals. I don't know. I don't think you ever did any really big ovals, right?
well, it really depends on the driver, though, because there are a lot of drivers like I think Jimmy Johnson likes a tighter race car, but sometimes it's a balance of what the driver, like you said, what the driver is comfortable with. Some are comfortable with those super loose cars, some are comfortable with the super tight cars, and with IndyCar, that's a it's a big adaptation going from your road racing, like even Formula One. I I can't imagine the massive difference that is trying to the balance that is going 220 miles an hour on an oval versus the only time you get reasonably close to that in Formula One is at the end of a straight. And even then, you slow immediately right down. You have that cornering speed, but it's not near the cornering speed of IndyCar, and how you place it, it it matters more than almost anything. It's the setup and how you place it. And if you can't get right exactly where you are in that corner scrubbing speed and you're not comfortable with that, then you're going to struggle. So
Yeah, and
that's
as you mentioned in Formula One, like if you get it wrong at the parabolica, the wall's not right there. You've got whatever it is, 100 feet of grass and sand trap before you hit a tire wall in front of a Tech Pro barrier in front of Armco. I mean, you've got a lot of time to slow down. If you lose it at Indy, you're spinning, and then about a second later, you are kissing the safer barrier. So yeah, it's a completely different experience. But for big ovals, specifically like Indy and Texas and Pocono that IndyCar runs on, or Daytona for NASCAR, the fastest setups have minimal downforce and minimal drag because that's how you go fast. And if you're not comfortable with feeling a car, or if you're not comfortable driving a car that is always on that razor's edge, you're never going to be fast on an oval. Um, Typically, you put on a little more downforce to make the car more comfortable, and if you put on too much, you're going to be slow. But if you're not comfortable with that car being very, very on the edge, then you're just never going to be fast. And I think a good amount of it also comes down to Chilton's team. He's on the Carlin Racing Group has only been in IndyCar for this is their second season. They're still learning oval setups. I mean, all the cars that got bumped at Indy were all Carlin based cars. Um, McLaren was working with Carlin. I mean, Max Chilton got bumped from Indy. He's a Carlin car, full time Carlin car. And Pato O'Ward was also a Carlin car for the 500. So I think they're just in general sort of missing something on ovals. But if you don't have a driver who's really good on them, you're never going to make that forward leap. So I'm glad that they brought in Connor Daly. And I mean, immediately that's given them some results because Connor finished 11th last night. Um, Whereas, Chilton didn't even qualify for Indy. So, I think it's a decision that was smart for both Chilton and for the team. And I give Chilton a lot of credit. He's saying I'm not comfortable doing this, and I think that takes as much, if not more, bravery than to get into a situation you're uncomfortable. So to
yeah,
say I don't want to do this, I'm not okay with it, that takes a lot of guts. So I commend him for doing that, and I hope that's just another piece that continues to push IndyCar for safety. And it's not like they're sitting on their laurels. I mean, again, in Indy, they announced the new aero screen being developed by Red Bull Racing or Red Bull Technology. Um, that is something that will absolutely save drivers' lives. So, that's the kind of thing that IndyCar needs to keep doing, and I'm glad they're doing it.
Yeah, and so we talked a lot about that. There's no easy transition here, so we're gonna jump right into the opposite of racing, Toyota. So Toyota has basically announced that they're going to continue running with the hydrogen technology that they've been sort of revolutionizing with the Mirai, I think is what it's called. That was their most recent hydrogen vehicle. But yeah, they've been sort of like the class leaders of hydrogen fuel cell cars. Um, they have mentioned that even though they are going to continue to develop EVs and hybrid technology, that they have not forgotten about hydrogen. And they also announced that, once again, proving why I think Toyota is one of the smartest brands out there right now, they have chosen to team up once again with their good friends at Subaru. This time, not for a fun.
Impossible.
And we're off the air.
That was less than 15 seconds.
This time, not for a fun sports car, but for a battery SUV, because that is the hellscape we are about to be living in. So, once again, they're sharing the immense cost of developing a whole new battery-powered SUV, which, again, this is like the third or fourth time Toyota's done this recently. Their Supra, the GT86, and now they're finally bringing that to commuter cars, where they're teaming up with another company, sharing that development cost, and therefore maximizing their profits. Now, Curly, I'll get your thoughts here in a minute, but I really think that Toyota is the smartest car company out there right now. This is a company that is the second largest automaker in the world, whereas VW has like 5 billion brands. Toyota has 3, and one of them is Daihatsu, so it's really 2.
3.5, because technically there's a fourth one out there, but they haven't made a car yet. Daihatsu is definitely they're a unique baby. But they also have some of the greatest. They have some of the greatest car names out there. Like they have the Midget, which actually Midget I love. I want to go on a very very brief Daihatsu tirade because the Midget is super cool. It's a single seater little baby pickup truck. It is better than any kind of side by side you can buy. And then they have the Naked, which is just the best car name ever. What are you driving today? I'm driving Naked and unfriended. I'm Daihatsu is certainly interesting. They're one of those car companies. They're like the Italian version of Lancia, but without the innovation. They're just like random and goofy, and it's like you've got all your established brands. You've got Toyota and Honda, and Nissan and Subaru, and then there's Daihatsu over there in like the special children's corner. But you know what? I gotta love them for it. I'm not making fun of them. They are a sweet little mini car company, and I hope that Toyota actually does something cool with them. If Toyota does with them what they tried to do with Scion, they might actually be successful. Anyway, back to Toyota.
We haven't even posted this video yet, or this podcast, and I'm already watching all the unsubscribers after your rant.
Are we gonna have negative subscribers after this?
I think we might. I think there are going to be people actively pushing to throw us off after that Daihatsu rant.
But yeah, giving them a wonderful mental image. Anyway.
Yeah,
I agree. I think Toyota is being really smart. They're reading the trends and they're understanding what their buyers really want in a car. I can bag on the Camry for being a terrible to drive car while also looking like it's a half breed of a Predator, but people like that. They want their cars to be boring to drive but awesome to look at and comfortable. Okay, I can't stand that, but I don't need to buy a Camry. I could buy a BRZ or a GT86. I can buy a Supra. Those are cars that are drivers' cars. Those are cars I would be interested in. Or if I want to buy a hatchback, I can buy their Corolla hatchback. So I've got options. If you
wanted a mid-sized truck, you can buy a Tacoma, which you might have.
Which I did. Exactly. So I mean, they've got. I don't have to agree with every single car they're building, but people are buying them, and if I don't like that car, they usually sell something else that I will want. So yeah, you're right. They're playing it really smart. Whereas someone like VW has a lot of overlap and sometimes has a lot of cars that nobody wants, like the EOS, which I think has finally gone out of production, but a little hardtop convertible. Yeah, like
I
I'm sure a
remember.
few people wanted that, but so yeah, no, you're right. I think Toyota's being really smart about it. They're playing for their strengths and they're working with other companies where there's weaknesses. So whether it's the Supra or the GT86 or as you said this new, I guess yet to be named SUV, um, it's they're playing to their strengths and they're working with companies when they don't have that. So yeah, they're playing it really smart right now.
Not much else to say. Toyota smart, Toyota good at car.
Toyota Smart. I'm looking at your notes here, and I will say I think one of the things that I wouldn't necessarily say it's smart that they're going for hydrogen. There are some major issues with hydrogen, mostly in how do we get it? Because right now, the way we get hydrogen is by splitting up methane or natural gas, which takes a lot of electricity, it takes more electricity to make the hydrogen than it would be to just stick that natural gas into an engine and run it off of natural gas. But batteries also aren't the answer either. And I actually I really thought about this when there was an article recently talking about I can't remember who it was. I think it was GM or Ford. They're trying to invest more in batteries. And maybe there's a discussion about no, I'm sorry, there's a discussion about tariffs and how they're going to start affecting Chinese tariffs specifically, how they're going to start affecting the cost of electric batteries in cars. There's going to be a critical mass because all those batteries are made out of precious metals and those metals only exist in a few places on earth, and unfortunately most of those locations are in third world countries, sometimes controlled by dictatorships. You genuinely don't want to know where the cobalt in your batteries comes from. It's truly horrifying. It'll actually make you want to like get rid of your phones and stuff. It involves child labor. I'll leave it at that. But the point is these are all finite resources that in many ways are actually more finite than the gasoline and oil we're burning right now for our gas cars. Batteries aren't the answer because there's going to be a point where we can't make any more batteries because those metals, we can't create them fast enough. The supply is going to be completely outstripped by the demand very soon as we move to electric cars. So what I do think car makers should do, and Toyota, if someone out there who works at Toyota is watching this, pay attention. Develop something that is not a battery. You need a electrical solution that is not a battery because lithium ion batteries, there's no way we're going to be able to make enough of them to satisfy the car demand. Because again, this battery is used in cars, it's used in phones, it's used in laptops, it's used in um, any kind of smart device. Lithium ion batteries are, they're ubiquitous in everything we own now, and cars are going to be a very small portion of that demand. So we need to develop something that is more sustainable than lithium ion batteries. I don't know what that answer is. I'm not an electrical engineer, but yeah, relying on batteries for electric cars is going to be a never ending scenario. It's never going to work
Well,
long
yeah,
term.
like you said, a lot of those consumer electronics, they're a lot smaller than the gigantic battery packs that we use in electric cars. And that's sort of the biggest issue right now is building these batteries. Where do these materials come from? How long can we sustain them? And I think that's the key reason why Toyota wants to keep hydrogen in the forefront and why they want to push hydrogen. Yes, it is going to be very difficult to figure out how we build it and how we ship it because we're very afraid of shipping hydrogen, as you should be. It's a very dangerous gas. And so those two are going to be very big problems. But if we solve them, and we can. I'm sure we've solved a lot. We've created a lot of amazing technology in our history. If we can solve those two big issues, hydrogen solves the issue of electric cars because those that hydrogen fuel cell works very similar to battery electric vehicles, except instead of those big battery packs that has to be recharged by more electric, and eventually you lose that capacity. You have you just have a tank, much like our gas-powered cars, but with hydrogen, which is at its core the most plentiful element in the universe. So if they can solve the problems of hydrogen, that's going to be big. And Toyota and a few choice other car companies, I believe GM has made a couple hydrogen cars in the past, hydrogen concepts in the past. I
They
could be
did and
wrong.
immediately crushed them.
They did.
And the EV1, yeah, they bought all those back and squashed them like friggin'
That's
morons.
that's the EV one. That wasn't hydrogen powered though.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, if we can solve those things, hydrogen is going to be big, and I commend Toyota for continuing to keep it in the forefront.
I agree. If we can solve how to get hydrogen relatively economically, then yeah, it is a wonderful solution. You're right. It is the most plentiful compound in the universe. The problem is the only way that we can get it right now is when it's bonded to something else. It comes out of another compound. So
And
yeah, there's
it's super efficient as well.
oh, absolutely.
They made a hydrogen prototype car that was wicked fast.
But yeah, I mean, it's an electric car that just instead of storing electricity in a huge battery pack, it stores its electricity in capacitors that are recharged by hydrogen ionization, which is, and of course, the byproduct of that ionization is good old fashioned water. So, it's, you're right. It is, if we can get past how to either harvest or produce hydrogen without massive amounts of energy investment, which in this case, again, the irony here is that we're getting our hydrogen from natural gas that has to be split using electricity that's usually made by natural gas. Until we can solve that issue, it's not as viable. But it does solve all the issues. It solves your range anxiety because, as you said, you just fill up the tank. It's not like you sit there for half an hour at a supercharging station. You plug in your hydrogen probe, and then less than 5 minutes later, you're on the road again, just like you do when you fill up your tank of gas. Um, there are far less harmful materials in a hydrogen fuel cell system. You don't have the major battery concerns that you have, or the environmental concerns you have with lithium-ion batteries, both in their production and disposal. Um, so it would be a huge advantage. We just have to get to that step. And unfortunately, the auto industry is not going to solve that answer. It's going to be, science, which we need to better fund, by the way. But either way, my whole point was batteries just aren't going to be a solution to electric cars, and we do need to figure out something else, whether it's hydrogen or supercapacitors or even just continuous charging on the road, whatever that happens to be. Relying on batteries for electric cars is just not going to be the solution.
Headline: Curly wants the world to be San Francisco.
To be
Moving on.
honest, that's an idea that came out of Top Gear, but it's actually a pretty damn good idea.
It's not the worst idea in the world.
No, it's not, and it's something that we could implement in the near future, especially as more and more cities are announcing that they want to ban gas cars. Okay, that's great. How are you going to charge all the electric cars? How are you going to power those things? Because they're seriously unprepared for that. But if you're just talking about adding a few extra power lines, that's relatively easy to do. So let's talk about something cool like race cars again.
Yes, we've been talking a while about many things, but we're gonna finish it out with something fun, because this week the world was rocked, and by world I mean several of us weirdos, was rocked by the Ford versus Ferrari trailer that we've been hearing about this movie for a while. I myself have been banging the drum for this for a long time. So Ford v Ferrari is a film about the 1960s, yes, 60s battle between Ford and Ferrari for supremacy in the 24 Hours of Le Mans. It's an awesome story about Ford bringing in Carroll Shelby, who's being played by Matt Damon.
I do want to jump in on Matt Damon. He doesn't even try to do a Texan accent.
He
That's just
tries. He tries.
barely. It's just so bad. mean, Carol Shelby is as Texas as they come, as they show a couple of times in the film, wearing the big old cowboy hat. But yeah, Carol Shelby is as Texan as they come, and Matt Damon really does not do Carol Shelby justice. Like, it's just. On the other hand, Christian Bale plays a British person beautifully because that's what he is, and it's still. It always gets a little weird when you hear him speak in his God given accent because we're so used to him as an American, and he does. Christian Bale is going to be great. I mean, and Matt Damon's good too, but his accent, Matt Damon just can't do accents. He's just really bad at
He's
them.
from Boston, okay? He does one accent really well, and that's Boston.
Yeah,
But he's
but
also an
Christian Bale is
excellent
British
actor.
and he does an American accent wonderfully,
Look,
like a New
we
York kind of.
American actors are bad at accents. We all know this, but accent aside, Damon is a phenomenal actor, so I'm sure he's going to do Carol Shelby plenty of justice aside from Carly's voice issues. But I for one can't wait to have 2 hours of Christian Bale doing his street tough British guy voice, which
Oh
is his
yeah,
natural voice.
it's a little disconcerting at first, but he's damn good at it. And I think I mean he was a great pick. I think both of them are still good picks. I wish someone would just give Matt Damon some better voice acting lessons, but yeah, I mean Christian Bale's great in it. Oh, and I don't know who they picked for Lee Iacocca, but nowhere near Italian.
John Barenthal.
Yeah, not Italian enough. I mean, I think there's some somewhat questionable casting choices. Like I'm going to continuously compare this to Rush because I truly love Rush. That because Rush really spoke to me. I love Formula One. I love the way it was directed. But you picked two actors who really landed their roles perfectly. Chris Hemsworth as James Hunt. Yeah, he's Australian, but he pulls off, a British playboy beautifully. Well, really any playboy Hemsworth could handle with no without any effort whatsoever. And then of course,
Daniel Bruhl.
yes, Bruhl. I knew his name was Daniel. I couldn't remember his last name, but Daniel Bruhl. He's I guess he's German naturally, and he plays an Austrian, a German a German heritage Austrian very, very nicely. So, it just sort of contrasts your two main characters as in Ford versus Ferrari versus the two in Rush. And really all the ancillary characters were well choiced in Rush as well. But no, I think this movie is going to be fun. It is still a great story. Um, the one thing that I couldn't really pull out of the trailer, and I haven't really looked too deep in it, is I don't know how um, how long they really run that story because Rush really I mean there's a little bit of backstory in Rush, but the main focus is the 1976 season because that was the season of Titans, whereas Ford versus Ferrari, the actual Le Mans, they didn't win their first time out, they got trounced. um, they got beaten a couple of years, and it wasn't until 1967 that they finally won and finally beat Ferrari. So I'm curious, does the story do they try to cram those 3 or 4 years into 1 year and one race, or do they actually spread it out the way that it actually happened?
So that's an
Or
interesting. That's
or actually, I have a third possibility. Do they only focus on the struggles to get that initial GT40 built? Because it was a very tight timeline. It was very difficult, but they pulled it off. So again, there's a couple of angles they could take this movie, none of which I could really glean from the trailer,
so
other than
I
making that one Ford executive crap his pants, which was wonderful. That actually was a really good part of the trailer.
that that was fantastic. So I think they did. I think they might have done that on purpose, actually, because there are going to be a lot of people that aren't nerds like us, and in the end, I think this movie really does need to appeal to them, and that's why they threw out Logan so heavily, and they threw out Bale so heavily, and why Bale was at the forefront of the film because they gotta sell it on that. They sell it on
Mm-hmm.
Logan, they sell it on Bale, but there
And
are
Matt
actually
Damon. Let's be fair. Matt Damon's pretty big star power too.
and Matt Damon, but Bale's a little brighter star. But there are some hints about what it's going to be about. There was a quote from James Mangold, the director, that he wanted to make this the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid of racing. And if you don't know the end of that movie and that story, it doesn't end well for them. But it was a real fun ride, and the title in the UK for this film is actually Le Mans 66.
Mm.
So that leads me to believe, and I don't know this for a fact, and I'm kind of glad I don't know this because I'm kind of interested how it's going to end, but I feel like they're going to cut it off at the loss. I think they're going to lose, and I think they're going to end the movie and do that black, do that like name on the screen that says, yeah, they went back years later and finally did win.
It
But I
wasn't
think
even years later. It was the very,
it was
was it the
next
next
year, right?
year? Yeah, I can't. I know this. Damn it. I know AJ Foyt won in a Ford GT40 at Le Mans, and I
I thought
can't
it was
remember if it was
Gurney that
60.
got the first win.
He was part of the team. Foyt and Gurney were both on the team. Um, there were 3 or 4 drivers, and Gurney and Ford were both on the same driving team. They won it together, and I just can't remember if it was 67 or 69. But I know that Foyt and Gurney drove together on that team, and see if they ever wanted to try a sequel, which who knows. I think it would be very interesting to actually to go into the driver's side of that because Dan Gurney and AJ Foyt they respected each other because now a little bit of history and context. They were both IndyCar drivers. Actually, Dan was he was in, well both of them. Actually, take that back. They were an everything driver. If you gave them something with 4 wheels, they would go race it. Um, Dan did Formula One. AJ really just stuck in the U.S. Dan was more of a sports car Formula One road racing driver, and AJ was an oval driver. But they could both adapt to either or. And while they both respected each other on the track, they were bitter rivals because they were on different teams. They were always trying to beat each other for the win, and they're always doing it in 2 different styles. So I think it'd be interesting to see the sort of the dynamic between those two as okay, you've got 2 guys who were battling it out for the Indy 500, and now they have to work together to win at Le Mans in the same car. I mean, that would be a very interesting story on its own, and the rest of the team as well, because it was an all American effort, I believe, with the Foyt team, at least on the driving side. Um, and if they do only focus on the first year, the GT40. I actually would really commend them for that because no one's going to expect everyone who doesn't know what's happening. And by the way, major spoiler alerts. We probably should have mentioned that a little bit earlier on. you know, Ford did not win their first year. They were going to war with Ferrari, and Ferrari beat the piss out of them, to be quite honest. But it's not a happy ending. It's one of those okay, we broke down, we crashed, we got beat, but we're going to get up and we're going to do it again next year. And if that's how they end the movie, I think that'd be great. It's not your typical happy ending. You can, it was a bitter disappointment when they lost, but if anything, that drove the team to try even harder, and they did. And eventually, they did beat Ferrari, and that was a truly great day. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it comes out. I mean, I'm excited that someone is focusing on a story like this because it is amazing, but it doesn't get me anywhere near as excited as Rush, which was sadly a movie that is well loved by car people and completely unknown by anybody who didn't see it when it came out.
Yeah, and I really hope that this doesn't fall into the the rush condition of being underseen, and I really don't think it will, because the names of Mangold uh, and Bale and Damon have really kind of jettisoned this. It's like the critic community of film is much larger than it was back in 2013, and people have already started to notice this trailer and this poster for Ford v Ferrari. So I'm really hoping that they can follow through and actually get the attention that it deserves. Because you mentioned Rush, you were a lot more invested in. I didn't know shit about the story of Niki Lauda and James Hunt before that, so I was pleasantly surprised to be blown away by it. But I do know a lot about the Ford and Ferrari story, and that's what gets me so excited about this because this is an amazing story. Like, there are a lot of amazing stories in racing. It's an amazing creative team. They did a lot of good casting. So I'm really excited for this. It's coming out in November, so Fox is kind of setting this sucker up for awards bait. So we'll see. We'll see.
I hope so too. But we all sort of thought the same thing in 2013 with Rush. I mean, it's a Ron Howard movie, and Ron Howard movies those are almost always Oscar bait. Um,
Eh.
Almost. I mean, Apollo 13. Um, shit, what else? I'm not a movie buff, but I mean, he's well known and well respected for doing really good, docudramas.
He's
So
well known, but Hollywood's a lot of a "What have you done for me lately?" and
Mhm.
you're gonna see Logan plastered all over the advertisements for this
Yep.
movie. That's gonna get
Yeah, but
people
I mean,
sold.
it's Ron Howard. You had Chris Hemsworth as one lead, who
Who was
again,
nothing at that point, by the way.
yeah, he wasn't nothing. I mean, he was known as Thor. That's what he was really known.
I think
But
Thor came out after. No, it
no, it
even
was before.
yeah,
I know for a fact because Avengers came out before Rush.
but
So,
he still wasn't as well known because Thor
but
wasn't
he was.
really
I mean, he
everyone's
was
favorite.
still a. Yeah, but he was still a. It was a big enough name, and then Daniel Bruhl was coming off of Inglorious Bastards. So, I mean, you're right. The amount of star power that was packed into Rush wasn't necessarily as big as Ford v Ferrari, but it was still there. It was the because I remember when that movie came out. And, this is going to be the movie that breaks. It's going to break the mold and get regular people interested in racing, and it really didn't did that. It really didn't do that.
I think it's gained a following over time, but no, it hasn't.
Yeah, somewhat of a following, and it's interesting because even a lot of car and racing people didn't really go and see it. They weren't really that aware of it. And I think a lot of that actually came down to the marketing. I don't think they pushed it in the same way. I mean, the fact that Bale and Damon were at the Indy 500, both waving the green flag, and they were a major part of those opening ceremonies. I mean, that shows the kind of push that this movie is getting. So that'll definitely help.
And we got a
Um,
trailer 5 months before the release date.
yeah, and it looks like they're pushing the story in the right way. This is a true American underdog story. This is Ford because Ford they were a behemoth in road cars, but they were a minnow when it came to racing. And actually, I don't know how much they'll get into it, which will be a real shame. Um, there were there was an embargo on auto manufacturers in racing, specifically due to Le Mans, specifically 1955, which that was the year that a car crashed and went into the crowd and killed many. I think it was 80 people. That is still to this day the worst racing accident ever. And after that happened, most car makers, especially all the car makers in the U.S., especially, put out an embargo on sanctioned racing. So um, even though there was NASCAR racing and IndyCar and stuff like that, officially Ford, GM, AMC, Chrysler, none of them were officially involved with any of those teams. Now that did not stop people like um, Anton Durnoff, the father of the Corvette, from quietly sneaking engines out the back door. But there was an official embargo on racing because of that disaster, and it was only right around that time that Ford specifically decided, what, this embargo is stupid and we're going to go racing. So a couple of years before, they had partnered with Team Lotus to go to Indianapolis and win the Indy 500. Um, and then a couple of years after that, they want to go to Le Mans and beat Ferrari. Now, strictly because of, to be honest, talk about a revenge story. Ford trying to buy Ferrari, Enzo literally giving them the finger as he walked out. Um, there's a lot of revenge in there, but again, Ford was a minnow in racing, Ferrari was the giant, and pushing that underdog and how we're gonna band together and pull off the impossible. Um, that's what Rush's marketing material missed. Was okay. You have the guy who was on top of the world, Nicky Lauda, damn near dies in a crash, and he's become the underdog. The dynamic of that movie and how it went back and forth between who was on top and who was the underdog is what made that movie. That's what should have made that movie interesting to people, and it never really got shown off in the trailers. It was always, oh, this is a movie about Formula One with a bunch of racing and a crash in the middle of it. which most people aren't going to be as interested in.
Yep, and that's why you saw a lot of the actors and the people in this trailer with a little bit of pants shitting executive.
Yeah, yeah, and there's they did show off some of the action, which you kind of have to. It's a racing movie, but a lot of it is, they were more focusing on the people and the story, and we want to pull off the impossible. We need your help. We want to beat Ferrari, who I guess at that time they were both dominating in. Well, no, I take that back. They were dominating at Le Mans. They were getting their asses handed to them in Formula One. So they were great in the 50s. They were great in the early 60s, and then they just started getting beat. And it wasn't until Niki Lauda that they started winning again. So, yeah, maybe I was just trying to think. No, it would have been too early, but it'd be so much fun to see just Daniel Bruhl as Niki Lauda off and as an Easter egg somewhere in the background of some shot at Ferrari. That would have been too late in the time period. But yeah, I think they're marketing it right. You're right. I think the star power is a bit bigger, and I truly hope people go and see this because it's another one of those stories that even if you're not a fan of cars and racing, it's still an epic story. You don't have to be a fan of football to enjoy a movie like Rudy, or you don't have to like ice hockey to enjoy Miracle. It's just the story that should drag you in there. And I hope this is another one of those movies that drags people in. And hey, maybe it gets some people interested in racing again.
Maybe, and then they watch Le Mans and get bored and go home.
Well, fortunately, see, this is where they're being really smart that they're putting this movie out long after Le Mans has passed.
There you go. So,
yeah, really, the question this year is Alonso going to win again, or is he going to break his car or something? Is his car going to break or whatever? And that's oh well.
And the answer is nobody cares.
Unfortunately, that is the truth. And there are people who care, but it's the amount of people who care about. I should say proportionally, the amount of people who care about Le Mans now and Le Mans then is much, much smaller. Le Mans is still a big race, but it does not hold anywhere near the prestige it did in the 60s, which is a genuine shame.
Yep. And with that, I think we gotta close this thing out, Curly. We've been yakking for a long time here.
We have. It's been a fun conversation though. The very strange flows. You talk about a merger and then supercars and then racing and then hydrogen cars and then racing again. So at least we're ending on a high note. So yeah, thank you all for watching or listening. Currently, we're only doing this in video. I'm trying to set up an audio side of it as well, so you can, for example, listen to it in your car if you're that kind of a person. So thank you for watching and listening. Like, subscribe, share, et cetera, all that good YouTube stuff.
All the internet things.
Yep, all those internet things. Meme us, do whatever. And we'll see you guys again next week.